So I'm going to tell you about a study that we've just very recently completed about the safe employment integration of recent immigrants and refugees. We wanted to find out about what it's like to integrate into the labor market in Ontario, including how that looks like for recent immigrants coming in to Canada via different streams, and for both government and privately sponsored refugees. So we wanted to know about people's experience looking for work, how newcomers prepare to enter the workforce, so what sort of programs and resources do they access, and where and when does that happen? And we had a specific interest in whether newcomers know about their rights as they enter the workforce, and whether they've received health and safety information and training. And for those who had some Canadian work experience, we wanted to know about their first job. So what were those jobs like? What was the quality of that work, including what sort of employment preparation and training had people received from their employer? So we did a series of key informant interviews and focus groups. The interviews were in-depth interviews with service providers, program developers, and policymakers who were employed in either the immigration or employment field. And all of our participants in this category saw many newcomers in their day-to-day job, or they were involved in either program or policy development. We also did focus groups with recent immigrants and refugees who were either actively looking for work or had some work experience in Canada. And these participants were also recruited via settlement agencies, and all were involved in some sort of employment preparation program. So this is the reason why 13 of the focus groups were in English, because in order to do some of those programs, people had to have a certain level of English language facility. We did 5 focus groups in Arabic, although we didn't do them ourselves. We had peer researchers do the focus groups. And that was because we had a small grant from SHIRK to specifically look at the experiences of Syrian refugees who'd arrived in Ontario and their experiences of looking for work and integrating into the workforce. So our data was collected predominantly in the GTA, but we also did some focus groups in Eastern Ontario and Northern Ontario. So I'll just tell you a little, oh no, I won't, I'll tell you first about this, then our sample. So the interviews and focus groups were transcribed and translated when that was necessary. We used a program called In Vivo to organize our data. The transcripts were then reviewed by the researchers and a code list was developed, and the data were coded by 2 researchers and then organized thematically. And we used an inductive approach, meaning that we didn't come into the study looking for particular themes, but rather our themes really emerged from the data, but of course with the aim of addressing the research questions that I outlined at the start. And so during our analysis, we identified key themes and patterns in the data, as well as gaps and contradictions. So just a little bit about our sample. 55% of the people who were in our study, this is actually just a focus group sample, were women. And we had a very nice distribution of ages and also actually of streams. So we had individuals who had arrived different streams to Canada, and including the spouses of economic stream immigrants, which are, I think, typically not necessarily involved in research because they've come not as the principal applicant. Most of the participants were from the Middle East, South Asia, and South America and Caribbean, although we also had representation from other regions. Our sample of participants was quite new to Canada, so 70% of the individuals participating had been in the country for less than 3 years. And they were very well educated, so 70% had at least some university training. So not necessarily a completed degree, but some university experience. And not surprisingly, they had very diverse professions in their home country. So engineering, education, skilled trade, business, health. And as Basak will talk about, when we asked them about their first jobs, that the types of jobs and professions they were working in Canada were quite different and more narrow. So I will now turn it over to Basak, who will talk about some of our findings.
Thank you. So after hearing all the questions, I would like to mention that we're mainly going to be focusing on the focus group findings. We integrated some of the findings from our key informant interviews, and I'll be presenting you the highlights or the key findings of our research, because after hearing the questions, we actually looked at many of the questions that you have asked, such as funding and small businesses. So if you have questions, we'd be happy to follow up in our answers. So the first thing we asked our participants was their experiences looking for work in Canada. And not surprisingly, almost every participant, regardless of their stream, reported great difficulty finding work. So the most common challenges that they told us was the language barriers, lack of Canadian experience, which was required. Canadian experience was required from all participants when they were looking for jobs or when they were in the interviews, and also the challenges of getting their foreign credentials recognized in Canada. And this was especially a big challenge for the refugees, because some refugees told us that they did not have the proper documentation, they couldn't bring it to Canada, or it was very hard for them to access the institutions in their home country to get this kind of information. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, following up Kevin's question from MOL, perhaps that could be an answer, is so getting the credentials recognized, that challenge meant for a lot of immigrants new education in Canada. So they felt like they had to go and re-educate, get some kind of degrees. However, older workers, that was a challenge for them because they felt like they didn't have time and they had so much experience and they did not want to go back and get education, which was actually one of the ways of getting into the labor market. So these challenges led to poor quality first jobs, so people called it survival jobs, which came with, meaning these kind of jobs came with feelings of depression and anxiety and loss of hope, particularly for economic stream immigrants, because they hoped to continue their profession in Canada, and they faced the challenges to do so. And we saw very high participation in volunteer work in our participants, and most participants told us that they mainly use their own community and family connections to find work. So I'm going to focus on these findings a little bit more. So almost all of our participants' first jobs were characterized by precarity. So participants told us that they usually were working they either found work through temporary agencies, which meant temporary jobs and short contract with low wages, and they gave examples of poor working conditions, such as being exposed to hazards at work or lifting heavy equipment, that they did not have the proper equipment to do certain tasks. And they also did not have training on the job when they were starting these jobs. And this was particularly an issue because most of the participants, their first jobs were new to them. So as Iggy mentioned, most of our participants came from diverse professions. So, however, the jobs that they have found in Canada were concentrated in either customer service or service jobs or food industry, construction, and trades. And participants found themselves in these jobs that they have never done before. And also some participants mentioned that they had to learn how to work in these new conditions, such as working in cold. So this created a challenge for them and in their first jobs. And they were paid less than Canadian workers, and some reported working for cash only. And actually, as Morgan mentioned, that we have heard from a few participants also that they were not paid at all for their job. And when they were injured, some reported that they were reprimanded. So I'm going to show you a few quotes from our focus groups that illustrates the first jobs and the situation that newcomers find themselves in. I'm working at the freezer and I stay for 8 hours, no giving us a break. I feel sick one day, sick like I can't breathe, and the cold. One day I passed out, I don't feel good, and no sitting in the room, nothing. Somebody came in and tell me, you better not say words. You're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to talk. You talk to the next person, we change you for another department. So this is another quote from one of our Arabic groups. Today they just fired a colleague of mine. She told me I'm out. So I asked her, why are you out? You work part-time. So she replied, I'm out because someone else came and accepted a lower minimum wage, so I'm out. She agreed with them for $12 or $13. Then someone came and went for $1 less than her, just $1. And another one. I was working in a pizza store. I didn't know how to use the oven, so that should have been part of the training because I burned myself several times. When I came to Canada, I realized that there's a minimum wage. I didn't know it before. I wasn't paid the minimum wage. Like he talked about, we do a lot of cash jobs, which is wrong, but I don't know what to do about it, and getting the job is more important, so you ignore it. And the last one from another focus group participant. I work in factory. After I came here, maybe for 3 months or 4 months, I was working in that, picking the package, the cartons, and keeping in the skids. And I told my supervisor, it is very heavy, and the job without people, I am just one. And now I have a problem in my back. I feel that I can't bend myself. He told me, remember, if you will go now, I will send a report against you to the temporary agency, and I will tell them that you have a problem in your back. They will not call you again for any kind of job, and maybe they will cancel your file. So these are only just a few of the examples that we heard from our focus group participants about their jobs. So another finding that we found is volunteers also, many of our participants told us that they have been involved in some kind of volunteer job because they felt that that was something that could help them to get familiar with the labor market and also get their foot in the door. And they were also encouraged by the service providers to engage in volunteer work, and also actually in Welcome to Canada and Welcome to Ontario guides, volunteer work is encouraged. Saying that this is something that you can do to get yourself familiar and get some Canadian experience. However, what we heard from our participants, although they said that it was helpful to get to know the community and at least felt some kind of purpose, however, that meant for our participants some extended unpaid labor with long hours that rarely resulted in paid employment. So this was a double-edged sword for them. Because it took time from their language training, looking for paid work or other responsibilities. So for example, this is a quote from one of our focus group participants who had been volunteering for a long time, and this is what she shared with us. It's helpful, yes, but it is 8 hours per day. You're spending them and you are helping people and you're exhausted and you're out of your home and leaving your kids and your responsibilities. What is the return? No tokens, no nothing. So maybe, Rania, this kind of speaks to those, also double-edged sword probably for the service providers because they may not be able to provide them with paid work. Also, volunteer work has consequences for occupational health and safety because many volunteers are not covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. So when we asked participants how did they found their first jobs in Canada, many told us that they used their ethnic community or family connections, and some found jobs through settlement agencies. And this was another double-edged sword because although these jobs provided them with some income and experience, however, they were often poor quality and rarely in immigrants' fields. And they did not help much with language training. So for example, we heard from our participants that they started a job and then they felt like it was taken away from their language training, or they felt like they could not communicate well, and then they left their jobs to get more language training. And this also was especially true for participants who found their jobs through ethnic communities because they sometimes did not use English at all. They were speaking in their own native language. And in those jobs, especially because they were owned by other newcomers, small businesses, sometimes the knowledge of rights and responsibilities was missing because the owner did not know, the owner of the business did not know about it, or they did not get any training around that. And when conditions of work were poor, so one of the things that was interesting in our key informant interviews, because service providers also connected newcomers with employment, and they said that especially when the conditions of work was poor, this put also service providers in an awkward position because they did not want to lose the connection with a potential employer. However, sometimes things came up, so that was a hard issue for the service providers to deal with as well. And one of the things that we heard from our participants when they get these jobs through personal connections or ethnic connections, they felt hesitated to speak up when things were not going great because they felt like they found these jobs through personal connections, and they felt like they could not speak up because they had to feel grateful, or it could be a cultural thing. So, for example, I will give you an example from this one focus group participant who have found a job through someone in their community, and this is what she says. I think that this chemical liquid is not good for me because all the time I have a runny nose, I cough and sneeze. I think it's chemical liquid and I need to tell my manager that this one is not good for me. And then she told me, if you say that, maybe you're going to lose your job, because she said, I need you to do it. And so it's very hard for me because she's from my country. I know her in my country. We have a tradition. You have to respect somebody if she's older than you. So I have to respect her, but sometimes she abuses me. So after hearing about the job search experiences and the experiences in their first jobs, we wanted to understand what kind of preparation do newcomers get on their way to find these jobs. So as Iggy mentioned, we recruited our participants mainly from settlement organizations. So that meant that almost all of our participants participated in some kind of language or employment preparation program. So, but the most of these programs really focused on either language development or typically the employment programs, typically resume building, networking, or cultural competency training. So when we asked our participants whether they have received any kind of health and safety training or resources, or whether if they knew what to do, they knew about their rights as a worker, the vast majority of our participants had extremely limited knowledge of employment standards. They knew nothing about the responsibility of the employer vis-a-vis training or safety equipment, and they did not know what to do if they were to ask to do something unsafe or if they were injured. So I'll show you a quote, and this is just one of many examples from our focus groups that we heard, and our conversation usually went like this. So the moderator asks, so you said you never received any information about health and safety. Did you receive information about your rights as a worker? And multiple respondents said no. However, I think it is speaking to the Morgan's point we found something that's a little bit different, because Morgan mentioned that they did not find much difference between the Canadian population and the newcomer population in terms of their awareness of their rights and responsibilities. And what happened is, because we heard that they did not know, but when we probed this question further, for example, we asked people, so what kind of training did you get about health and safety? What do you know about their rights? I found out that they had a different understanding of these concepts. So perhaps this could be that they may not know what they don't know. So for example, when we asked about their worker rights, the participants who had some idea about worker rights told us about the workers, their responsibility on the job. So we said, do you know about your rights? And then they said, yeah, I know that I have to do these and I have to do this. When we asked about health and safety, the ones who have received some kind of training or resources, they mainly talked about WHMIS, about the hazardous substances, or they remembered taking some kind of online training. But many of them, they told us, yes, I actually signed a contract. And then when we probed further, that was actually an employment contract that they signed about their work hours. That was not necessarily related to health and safety. And the ones who received some kind of safety information mainly told us that, yes, they have received health and safety information, but when we probed further, it was clear that it was mainly about client and customer safety. So for example, they said, well, I got the food safety handling program, and then they said, well, this is what you need to do to keep the food safe or the client safe. However, it wasn't much about the worker health and safety. So When we heard about the programs that were offered, so we talked to our also key informants who are program developers or service providers. They told us that these kind of programs related to health and safety, when offered, were usually tended to be one-offs and focused on basic human rights and employment standards. So there wasn't a systemic training or resources provided to newcomers, and most of it is because we heard from our key informants is that the lack of funding for these kind of programs or resources was a big challenge. And programming also was described as client-driven, which meant that if newcomers did not ask for this kind of information, it was not provided. However, newcomers usually focus on simply finding work when they first come, and many of our newcomers, when they were looking for jobs, they told us that they were hoping to get good jobs, so they may not think that they will end up in these kind of conditions. They may not find themselves in these kind of conditions, so they may not feel like they need this information. And also, as I mentioned, you don't know what you don't know. If you don't know about your rights or health and safety, you may not ask for this. And of course, as I mentioned, most service providers had limited capacity to provide this information, had only capacity to provide basic information because their organizational resources were already stretched. So they had limited funding, they had high client loads, and they had other priorities also. They were putting out other kinds of fires that felt more urgent for them. They told us that when they were asked or approached by a newcomer, they tend to refer newcomers to other websites when they have a problem. So usually we're being told that Welcome to Canada is a good guide, or Ministry of Labor websites. However, we heard this from also our participant that these websites are not very easy to navigate, and sometimes the resources actually may not be that helpful to newcomers. It could be because of the language level that they provide information in, or telling newcomers what to do. So, for example, this is a Welcome to Canada guide. It's actually 148 pages long. And we have a few paragraphs about employees' rights, just generally telling newcomers that they do have some rights in the workplace. And in the last paragraph, if you can't see, what it tells newcomers to do if you feel like they are being treated poorly, they should go and speak to someone at the Ministry of Labor. Unfortunately, we didn't hear from any of our participants who have done that, going and speaking to someone. And now I'm going to turn to Iggy to talk about our implications.
All right, we are a little bit over time, so I'll go very quickly. Okay, so we started the study with the question of how can we help prepare newcomers to safely integrate into the labor market. And unfortunately, we didn't come away with any very easy answers. We did really like something that one of our service providers or participants said, and that is it has to be done at many different times and in many different ways. So it has to be much more systematic. One of the things we found is that individuals will come into programs, they might stay for some language training, then they'll get a job, then they might leave that job. And so if you're offering just a one-off workshop, that often will not help a great number of people. And like Basak said, the onus can't be only on newcomers asking for the programming. It just can't be directed by the newcomers. It also has to start early at lower link levels, because certainly the participants in our study, they were coming to Canada and right away they were starting to look for work so that they had some economic security. And it can't involve only sending people to websites, for the reason that some of these websites are not easy to navigate and just don't contain the sort of information that newcomers need. It also can't only depend on the employer doing his or her part. Ideally, of course, the employer would be the one who would provide training, would tell the worker about his or her rights, would provide safety equipment, but we know that doesn't always happen. And so we really need to think about using a carrot and stick approach, and for those employers who are doing that, of rewarding them, and for those who are not, giving them fines, frankly. And, there was another idea that was raised in the study, which is to target the sectors and companies specifically that employ newcomers to make sure that they're helping people integrate into the labor market safely. We do think that this process of work integration should involve the settlement sector, because settlement organizations were discussed as being trusted resources. And one of the things that's really useful about going to a settlement agency is that you can raise issues of employment standards. You can say, what are my rights? What am I entitled to, without worrying about losing your job. And the thing is, though, if the settlement sector is to be involved, it must include an infusion of sustained funding and expertise, because these organizations are already doing so much work, and so to expect them to do something in addition to what they're doing without some sort of sustainable funding is it's just not right. We also need to think about how to reach newcomers who do not access settlement services for employment preparation. The two studies that so far that we've presented, that's how we've accessed our participants, but there are many newcomers who don't access settlement services, so how do we reach those workers? And Basak touched on this, but there also seems to be a focus on what is expected of workers and newcomers, and not necessarily on what workers are entitled to. And this is a really interesting quote from one of the participants in Arabic. It was in Arabic and was translated. So this person said, basically, the conversation always revolves around the host community and not about the newcomers. Nobody leads you by the hand and says, this is your right and this is what you deserve. Rather, this is what we want. This is what we expect. When I went to school for ESL, the teacher would say, you came here as newcomers, so you have to respect the rules and laws of this land, which is a given. She would give you a list of have-tos and a to-do list, but she never mentioned what Canada needed to do for newcomers. So I think there's a need to sort of balance this focus. So thinking about, yes, what can newcomers do for Canada, but what should we be doing as Canadians for newcomers and to help them safely start work? The other thing that we found was there really was a bit of a diffusion responsibility around some of these issues. So, and what I mean by that is there was an assumption that information and resources were being offered by someone else. So service providers, for example, said, well, some employers assume that if a worker is recruited through a settlement agency, they've received training, which often wasn't the case. Some of the policymakers we spoke to said, well, I'm assuming that workers will get training when they start work. The employer will give them training. Or they're doing this job readiness program at a settlement agency, so obviously they must be getting training through that. So everyone thought everyone else was doing something. So I think what's really necessary is that we need to have a champion, both at an organizational level and at a system level. And certainly the organizations who were providing these resources, there was always a kind of a health and safety champion in that organization, so someone who was knowledgeable about these issues. And we need that at a system level. We need a policy maker or agency to say, yes, we will look at this issue and we will make sure that it's getting done, because there's so many people involved in this work integration and preparation process. And then the last thing I want to say, which is something that I am very passionate about, is that there are many existing employment resources for newcomers, many. So many about the labor market in Canada, how to find jobs, how to build your resume. And this is an ideal place to include some health and safety information, employment rights information, and even what to do if you are injured in the workplace. So we'll stop there, and we look forward to your questions and comments.